It could either break you or make you, and if it breaks you, you know what, you're just gonna just be broken, physically and mentally. Oh, I haven't seen a tree or a plant since 2003.
The only thing that I've seen is a spider in the corner, and I find them little bugs sometimes and I feed the spider. That's about the only closest thing to nature I have.
Introducing the costs of confinement. A rise in imprisonment. Augmented members of youth incarceration. Increasing levels of prison violence. These are the detrimental effects of solitary confinement. The use of this practice has been steadily increasing throughout the United States, causing prolonged psychological effects, namely post-traumatic stress disorder.
Now we will be interviewing Mrs. Thomas, a businesswoman who is an advocate for the implementation of solitary confinement in prisons in America. Mrs. Thomas, can you please tell us why you're in support of this practice?
You see, the government dictates that solitary confinement cannot lead to cruel or degrading human treatment. Prisoners are kept on a tight leash for the safety of other prisoners or punished for their misdeeds. I believe that this is fair retributions for the crimes they have committed. If the government safely regulates their mental and physical health, I don't see a single problem with solitary confinement.
Well, if you've seen the trauma and mental breakdowns that have occurred to hundreds, if not thousands of prisoners, you may think otherwise. Are you aware that the system has resulted in a multitude of issues, riots, suicides, and people with PTSD?
What? No, I wasn't aware.
Oh, okay then. Well, this concludes our interview, Mrs. Thomas.
Oy vey.
Solitary confinement is primarily used to protect vulnerable prisoners or segregate especially dangerous ones. It can result in severe chronic apathy, lethargy, depression, despair, social atrophy, and in extreme cases, self-mutilation. In many prisons, self-harm leads to more time in solitary confinement. In a 1951 study at McGill University, an experiment on sensory deprivation was conducted on a group of male graduate students who stayed in small chambers and wore goggles and earphones to limit their senses. After a week, all of them couldn't handle the cognitive effects and hallucinations that they experienced. My friend Stuart Gracian from the Harvard Medical School reports that 1/3 of solitary inmates are suicidal, while researchers found that from 1999 to 2004, deaths of prisoners in solitary confinement account for more than half of all suicides.
Prisoners every day are given only 1 hour of exercise in a small confined cell. They are not allowed contact with any outsiders, and this exercise is often letting them get into their heads that they will forever be alone, and that 1 hour of supposed exercise is just more psychological torture and taunting to the prisoner. This prisoner has been temporarily let out of solitary confinement in order to have an interview with me. So, prisoner 9035, I know you have had a lot of stressful and traumatic experiences while in solitary confinement. If it is not too stressful for you, can you please describe it to us?
Well, for starters, this is the most I've talked to anyone in years. I haven't seen or spoken to my family in what seems like forever. I've occasionally questioned my own existence because of my lack of contact with outsiders. I couldn't even have guessed in my nightmares that committing an impulsive and terrible crime at the age of 17 could land me in a life sentence without parole and in solitary confinement. Sometimes I lie awake at night and think about receiving the death penalty.
There's a type of factitious disorder called prisoner psychosis that develops commonly when people are imprisoned, especially when they are placed in solitary confinement. Can you describe what it feels like to experience such a traumatic condition?
With this disorder, I've constantly inflicted injuries on myself. I would frequently have delusions of paranoia, affecting both my physical being and my mental state. It's not a place I want to stay in.
Thank you for having this interview with me today. If you could have one message left for everyone about solitary confinement, do you think that this should be placed on prisoners in the future?
No, definitely not.
Thank you. And this is the place where our prisoner had to live for 30 days. 30 days.
There are about 80,000 prisoners currently in solitary confinement. The place that a bed and a sink and a toilet. Barely edible food is delivered through a door, and prisoners are given 1 hour of exercise in a cage. Some spend days, some spend years in torture.
Beginning in the early 1970s, prison and jail administrators at the federal, state, and local level have relied increasingly on isolation and segregation to control men, women, and youth in their custody. In 1985, there were a handful of control units across the country. Today, more than 40 states have super maximum security, or supermax facilities, primarily designed to hold people in long-term isolation. Prisoners can be placed in isolation for many reasons, from serious infractions, such as fighting with another inmate, to minor ones, like talking back to a guard or getting caught with a pack of cigarettes. Other times, prisoners are thrown in solitary confinement for not breaking any rules at all. Prisons have used solitary confinement as a tool to manage gangs, isolating people for simply talking to a suspected gang member.
A 2016 study I conducted at Yale and the Association of State Correctional Administrators found that 29% of solitary inmates spend 1 to 3 years in isolation. Another 29% spent 3 months to a year, and 13% spent at least a year in solitary. Nearly 11% were there for 3 years or more.
For most of the 20th century, prisoners' stays in solitary confinement were relatively short. Here is Dr. Craig Harvey, who has a PhD in social psychology.
People would often get thrown in the hole for a couple of days at a time, maybe a couple of weeks at a time. My research has explored the psychological effects of incarceration, and I've found that prolonged exposure to the use of solitary confinement creates extremely painful memories that can last a lifetime. This can severely change the relationship they have with their spouses, children, and other family members even after their release from prison, which often may never occur.
2 types of solitary confinement are commonly in use today. The first is disciplinary segregation, which is punishment for inmates already behind bars. A prisoner would be administered with disciplinary segregation if they commit a crime such as petty theft or misconduct. With this type of segregation, confinement can only last up to 60 days. The second type of confinement is more severe. This is known as administrative segregation, which is used when prisoners are deemed a risk to the safety of other inmates or prison staff. Confinement can last for a short term, not specified.
In our interview with Tanya, a former convict placed in solitary confinement, she describes her memories and the generally distressing experience she was subject to. Tanya, may you please take off your mask for this interview?
Okay, I really want to remain anonymous, though. I cried so much, and I felt so overwhelmed and consumed by the painful memories. I wanted to talk to the prison staff about the closet I was confined to, but they ignored me because they couldn't engage prisoners in conversation. I experienced flashbacks to abuse from my mother, had terrifying nightmares, and suffered from phobias about rats and dogs biting me.
Solitary confinement does not result in positive reformation of prisoners. It often causes recidivism, or the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend, more likely to occur. 61 to 92% of those who were released were rearrested in various states, compared to 49 to 68% of regularly confined prisoners being rearrested.
As you can see, the government is spending money on materials to confine prisoners and sentence them to the solitary confinement punishment, but the prisoners are not greatly contributing to the economy. They are not working regular jobs to provide money for their survival. How can the country move forward if a large majority of the population is wasting their lives away in a cell?
We can look to states such as Colorado and New Mexico for effective reformation measures that they have taken. They began to reduce their use of this system, while North Carolina banned the practice of solitarily confining juveniles, and Nebraska outlawed it as a penalty for disciplinary infractions.
When officials determine that an inmate must be segregated from the general population, that inmate should be housed in a safe, humane place that ideally prepares the individual for reintegration into both the general prison population and society at large. Colorado hasn't released a prisoner from solitary straight to the streets since 2014.
Instead, this state has repurposed one of its super max facilities to use for a step-down program where inmates are allowed outside of their cells for a minimum of 4 hours a day and can participate in social and recreational activities. Another unit allows them outside for 6 hours a day, but inmates are required to participate in programs that improve problem-solving skills and try to change the criminal thought process. Colorado has also been developing a program where someone who would have gone into solitary but now spends 10 hours a week in therapeutic treatment and 10 hours on other activities outside their cell.
Legislation needs to be passed in order to grab the attention of Congress. They are aware that this issue is happening, but they need to act fast. While there are laws already passed and it is cruel and unusual treatment, Congress needs to take the step to ban it overall. Since solitary confinement is a violation of the Constitution and that it is cruel and unusual punishment, litigation is a viable option in order to have a full passing law that bans solitary confinement. We need to make solitary confinement a federal issue and place regulations on all of the states and unify them into banning this physical and mental cell that feeds off the psyches of its prisoners.
Another approach we can take is to informally conduct grassroots lobbying for the ban of solitary confinement by contacting members of Congress. Old and young people alike can join together to advocate against this practice through phone calls, emails, and other forms of communication in order to help their family members and friends who are affected by this terrible practice. Additionally, the cost of a gradual ban on solitary confinement will be taken out of the government's discretionary spending budget. $600 million will be taken out of the budget to slowly integrate the solitarily confined inmates into a regular prison environment. You see, this cost is nothing compared to the $78,000 spent on each solitary confined prisoner. With over 80,000 people being held in such conditions, $6.2 billion is spent annually on the upkeep of the system. Additionally, a possible unintended consequence is that the general population of the United States will protest against the release of prisoners from solitary confinement due to their perceived greater danger and negative influence on other prisoners.
If this issue continues any further, prisoners will continue to be locked up.